Good morning. It's lovely to see so many of you. I guess first of all I wondered how many cat or dog owners in the room? Yes. Okay, how many single people in the room? Okay. How many people in partnerships? Okay. So how many people are both single and have a cat or a dog? Oh, I love there's a timidity to put out the arms. Me. Isn't it funny that it's somehow a little bit taboo to be those things, which is really odd, because I know plenty of mothers and fathers who have cats and dogs. What's that whole thing about the crazy cat lady about? It's interesting, it hasn't really been the crazy dog lady, it's been the crazy cat lady, because I think the dog is still a man's best friend. But you know what I mean? But a cat is this whole thing, because it's not really about the cat. It's about the fact that that woman is childless. She's probably single as well, but she's definitely childless. She might be living with someone, she might not. I mean, at what point did I become the crazy cat lady? I've had cats my whole life. You know, so at what point did I cross that invisible threshold into craziness? It's about my childlessness. It's not about the cat. And actually, you know, my cat, I mean, she has to go to a support group of her own, you know, to deal with all of these societal projections that she's having to cope with as not just anyone's cat, but that childless woman's cat, you know, that one that keeps talking about being childless. So today I just wanted to really open up that subject. You know, what is going on that our culture has a problem with single childless women? I mean, in one generation, my generation, I was born in 1964. I was born to a Catholic teenage unmarried mum, and it was a shocker. You know, it was, people think the 60s were, you know, liberal. They weren't really if you were there until, you know, it was a certain sort of subculture that was starting to create that liberality. But if you were, you know, a working class Catholic girl, it was absolutely not okay to get pregnant at 17. Which my mum did, and there was no legalised and safe abortion, and the only option really was to give up your child for adoption. So I was born in the Catholic Home for Fallen Women on Honeypot Lane, a building which later became the DVLA office, which somehow feels really interesting. And after I was born, my mum changed her mind about putting me up for adoption, and so the nuns threw her out. She had nowhere to go, her family had disowned her. She split up with her boyfriend, my father, and so she had nowhere to go. I think I might have got a bit of a rebellious streak from my mum, because she then baptised me Protestant. I am the only Protestant in a family of Catholics. So, but you know, you fast forward a generation, and actually now, so to be an unmarried mother, that's what all the articles in the Daily Mail were about, how unmarried mothers were basically, you know, destroying the fabric of British society. That's what it was like in the 60s and 70s. And now, the most shamed female stereotype is a single woman over 40 without children. You know, and if you look at that, that's one generation, that shift. It really starts to speak about how powerfully something's going on in the culture. That would be better to be an unmarried mother now than it is to be a single childless working woman paying your taxes. It's like, what's that about? So if we put it into a little bit of context, we have the largest number of women without children. And I think it's important to say that rather than childless women, because we have 1 in 5 women turning 45 without children. Now, there is no hard data as to how many of those women have chosen that and would be called child-free, that's what they prefer, and how many women would have wanted to be mothers but it didn't work out. And depending on the data you look at, which is all analysing data rather than hard data, the numbers who are child-free by choice range from sort of 10 to 40%. You know, but so some of those will have chosen, a great many won't have chosen. And in my work with Gateway Women, I'm really starting to notice a shift, because I started it 5 years ago, that many women who are joining my organisation and seeking support from me and from each other, who were born in the 1970s, it seems a great many more of them are childless because of social infertility than those of us born in the 1960s. And social infertility is being childless because you either haven't been able to find a partner during your fertile years, or the partner you're with doesn't feel quite suitable enough to have children with, or he's saying he's not ready yet and you're waiting, or he doesn't want children, or he already has children and doesn't want more. You know, these are kind of some of the things. And I think this is one of the major reasons that women are, that we have more single women and more single childless women than we've had before. I just wanted to read you something from a quote from a book which is by Virginia Nicholson. It's called Singled Out: How 2 Million Women Survived Without Men After the First World War. In 1917, the senior mistress of Bournemouth High School for Girls stood up in front of the assembled sixth form, nearly all of whom were dressed in mourning for some member of their family, and announced to them, "I have come to tell you a terrible fact. Only 1 out of 10 of you girls can ever hope to marry. This is not a guess of mine, it is a statistical fact. Nearly all the men who might have married you have been killed. You will have to make your way in the world as best you can. The war has made a lot more openings for women than there were before, but there will still be a lot of prejudice. You will have to fight. You will have to struggle." These young girls would become the generation of never married women, called the surplus women. And that's what they were known as in the 1920s. And if you read literature of the period, it's very, very strongly about these women. And in a way, that was the last time childlessness was at this rate in the population, 1 in 5, was this generation, the generation born around 1900. Now that generation had the greatest loss of life, the war with the greatest loss of life we've ever seen, the First World War. And then it also had those that did find partners. Many of them weren't able to marry because of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So it took the largest loss of life and the biggest global depression there's ever been to create the rate of childlessness that we also have now, which I think is really interesting to kind of see that there's something enormous going on here. But what I find from my own experience of having to work through this and working with very many single women, sort of through Gateway Women, is that very few women understand the social and economic context of their experience, and instead think it's all their fault, because this is what we're hearing from the culture. You made stupid choices, you should have married him, you're too picky, you're too clever, you're something, whatever it is, it's basically your fault. And actually, no, I'm part of something very big that's happening. And this is a big piece of social change that I'm involved in. I haven't really chosen this, but this is a moment. And I call the generation born in the 60s and 70s the shock absorber generation for the sexual revolution. Because if you think about it, in one generation we've had the pill, legalised and safe abortion, women's access to higher educations, women's access to the professions, and fertility treatments. In one generation. It has completely changed the dating and mating landscape between men and women. And men have different choices and opportunities now. They don't need to get married in their 30s or their 20s anymore. I mean, it's not about sort of you get a girl pregnant and then you have to marry her. Everything has changed. But we are still struggling to understand how much it's changed and how our situation fits into that context, rather than it just being about the choices we've made. And I have a kind of a little story about that, which is, if you imagine, let's say twins. They look the same, they have the same kind of intelligence, the same kind of interests, they go to the same school, they go to the same university, they study the same subject, okay? Really pretty similar, two very similar people. And in university they both meet boyfriends, and as university ends, one of them breaks up with their boyfriend and one of them stays with their boyfriend. And over the next few years, the one who stayed with her boyfriend, they decide they're going to give it a go, and they decide to get married and have children, whereas her twin sister goes through a series of fairly, of interesting relationships in her late 20s and early 30s, but none of them turn into the one that feels right for both of them to settle down and have children. So you arrive at sort of mid-30s, one of them is maybe married with 2 children, and one of them is single and childless. How can we say that the one who is a failure is because of her choices. And it's luck. It's so much about luck. If she made exactly the same choices as her sister, but just had different luck in who she met, then how can everything she's ever done in her life be wrong? And that's the kind of narrative that single childless women over 40 are given. It's like, it's about the choices you made that were wrong. And I think we really need to start thinking about the fact that actually it's really hard to cram all that in before your fertility runs out. And if you do manage it, you're lucky. You didn't make smart choices, maybe you did. But it's not always about that, because not all of this is under our control. And I think if we can start to understand that, we can maybe be more compassionate towards ourselves as childless women. We can be more compassionate to the childless women we know. And we can basically sort of, cut ourselves some slack a bit and start pushing back against some of those stereotypes. In the UK, 10% of adults 25 to 44 now live alone, 5 times the rate of 1973. And in the US, it's risen from 17% in 1970 to 27% in 2012. And around the world globally, living on your own is up 30%. I mean, this is a really big shift in developing countries, in developed countries. But there's also, I don't know if you notice, but there's lots of articles in the press often about how, if you have children, you're happier. If you don't have children, you're happier. If you're married, you're happier. If you're single, it's like this obsession with basically, who's doing best. But there was some really interesting research that Daniel Kahneman did in his, he talks about it in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it showed that results of an analysis of the days of women who were single and the days of women who were married showed, quote, no difference in experienced well-being between women who lived with a mate and women who did not. And I quote here, women who have a mate spend less time alone, but also much less time with friends. They spend more time making love, which is wonderful, but also more time doing housework, preparing foods and caring for children, all relatively unpopular activities. And of course, the large amount of time married women spend with their husband is much more pleasurable for some than for others. Experienced well-being is on average unaffected by marriage, not because marriage makes no difference to happiness, but because it changes some aspect of life for the better and others for the worse. Bella DePaulo, who is an American academic who coined the phrase singlism, which is really about how there is an enormous prejudice against single people. And that kind of research, which has been replicated over and over again, doesn't make the headlines. The stuff that makes the headlines is the stuff that supports what she calls matrimania, this idea that it's only married people that can be happy, and that it is some kind of exalted state that we should all be aspiring to, and if we don't get there, we screwed up. Which is really interesting because, I've been married and I'm divorced and I see the inside of other people's, relationships, and, it took me a long time to get to the point where I am now. I've been single for 5 years, but it mirrors a little bit my journey of recovery from childlessness. For a long time, I felt that I was locked out of life's happiness because I hadn't been able to have children. That I had got some fundamentally, I'd been given the booby prize for life, and I was never going to get over it. And then gradually, as I went through my grief and I came out the other side, I began to realise that actually I had a different life to women who were mothers. Not a better life and not a worse life, a different life. That both types of ways of being an adult woman were complicated and had moments of joy, moments of terror, moments of boredom, moments of regret. It's not, becoming a mother wasn't going to somehow give me a free ticket to happiness. It was just a different experience. And I've started to realise that about being single. Number one, it really took me by surprise, but it really suits me. And that's the thing, it's so countercultural. There's definitely the 5, nearly 6 years I've been single have been the most peaceful, the most productive, the most creative, the most drama-free of my adult life. And it actually, it does actually really suit me. I'm not saying that I would, never contemplate being in a relationship again, but it's no longer about that there isn't anything missing from my life anymore. I would love to add something extra if it was the right thing for me and the guy, but I'm not missing anything. And I've come to understand that being single and being in a partnership one is not better than the other. Once again, it's like, oh no, they're just different. But this is like not the message we're getting at all from the culture. And I remember a conversation I had, and this was, I suppose it must have been about 9 years ago. I was at a drinks party, and a friend of mine who's child-free by choice was being chatted up sort of in the corner over there, and I could just hear what was going on, and this guy had really been pursuing her for the whole party, he was like following her around, and he just wasn't getting anywhere, and you could see he was getting frustrated, and he said, if you're not careful, you're going to end up as one of those old women with loads of cats. And she said, if everything goes to plan. And I just laughed out loud, because I didn't at the time really understand how radical and brilliant it was of her, but it stayed lodged in my mind. And in the years, since, as I've started to accept that, that I'm childless, and, I accept that I'm single. I don't know if that will change. Childlessness is definitely not going to change, but, I might not always be single. But it's so countercultural for us to be happy, to be okay, and I think that's, why this whole crazy cat lady thing has just sort of, snuck out the cat litter box and into mainstream culture. It seems to have come out of nowhere. I haven't seen it, but I've heard there's a really horrendous version on The Simpsons, and she has about 14 cats and smells of cat pee and is completely insane. So The Simpsons is always quite a good cultural barometer. So it really has gone mainstream, this idea. But why would single childless women or single child-free women be seen as such a negative aspect? Why shame us? If you think that possibly 25% of the mature female population soon will be childless, what's going on that we want to shame so many women? And I think it's about power. I think it's that we are an incredibly powerful force within the culture, but we're actually loose cannons, because within the patriarchal system, we are nobody's wife, nobody's mother. We are not taking care of the male line. Patriarchy means rule of the father. So we are not part of that system because we're not involved. And if we're stepmothers, we're sort of part of it because we're helping bring up someone else's children. But being a childless stepmother, do you know what? I used to think that would be nice, but I think I dodged a bullet. Now I understand more about it. It can be really, can be rewarding, can be incredibly hard. But we are liberated, we are educated, we are financially independent. If we actually stopped feeling ashamed and actually realised our collective power, we could cause a lot of trouble. How do you feel about the rhetoric of hard-working families that the politicians spout? Well, I think I even heard a collective tut, which is really how I feel. Yes, although when we look at the thing that happened in the Labour leadership debate, that whole spat between Liz Kendall and stuff about one being a mum and one, that the woman who was a mum understood life better than the one who was childless. So, this stuff can, it's just underneath the surface. It can come up quite easily between women as well. But when people say, well, patriarchy, what's that? And it's like, well, it's like asking a fish, how's the water? And the fish would say, what's water? It doesn't know. It's just there. It's what all around us. And the paradigm of patriarchy is one where women are there really to serve the male line. It's not something thought up in a back room by a bunch of men who want to make us miserable, because it doesn't actually necessarily, in our modern age, serve men very well either. It's a very, very old-fashioned system, which arose when we first developed agriculture and we first had property. And so then it became important to know who was your child so that you could pass on your property. Before we had property, we didn't have patriarchy. And that's when women and women's fertility became property. So, this is very old stuff we're working in and trying to change. In America, I don't know if any of you have heard about this book that's just came out on the 1st of March. It's been a lot in the press. Rebecca Traster's All the Single Ladies. And she set out to write a book about single women. and actually ended up writing a historical book as well as a contemporary book, because it has been shown in the US that single women have been the biggest, basically put Obama into power, and are one of the biggest one of the biggest bloc groups of voters now in the US. And this is a quote from her book. "Single women are upending everything. Their growing presence has an impact on how economic, political, and sexual power is distributed between the genders. The ability for women to live unmarried is having an impact on our electoral politics. The vast numbers of single women living in the United States are changing our definitions of family, and in turn will have an impact on our social policies. The intensity of the resistance to these women is rooted in the perhaps unconscious comprehension that their expanded power signals a social and political rupture as profound as the invention of birth control, as the sexual revolution, as the abolition of slavery, as women's suffrage, and the feminist civil rights, gay rights, and labour movements. Though it may feel that the growing numbers of unmarried women and the influence they wield have shaken the nation only in the past 5 decades, in fact, the story of single women's nation-shaping power is threaded into the story of the nation itself." When I was putting together my thinking about this talk, it was very interesting that most of the thinking around this issue, particularly around being single and the political and social implications for the culture of there being so many of us, most of it's coming out of the US. I don't think that as yet we have quite realised what a powerful group we can be, and I don't think politicians have woken up to it yet either. There are 1.5 million childless women in their 40s and 50s in the UK alone. That doesn't include child-free, and if we include women in their 60s and 70s, we are a very large group, and really no one is speaking to us. If anything, occasionally we get quite, well, I work with AWOC, the Aging Without Children Collective, and it's like, well, you didn't have children, so it's your own fault that you're going to age on your own. It's really, really interesting how, and it's like, well, if I've spent my life paying taxes for other people's children to go to schools, to go to hospitals, to drive on roads, and I do that willingly and happily, then I don't think it's unfair that at the end of my life there should be enough support for me to age in dignity. So I think we've got some big issues ahead of us that we need to campaign for, and to do that we need to come together as a tribe, and we need to, we need to embrace our crazy cat lady identities, because when we are no longer ashamed, we just laugh. When someone calls me a crazy cat lady, I think I'm saying, well, actually, I think I need more cats. So it's like, it really disarms people. You cannot shame me with my singleness or my childlessness, because I am who I am. I'm proud to be who I am. I'm proud to be giving a voice to our experience. Not only is there nothing wrong with us, but we're living through a time of extraordinary global change. And I think perhaps the reason there are so many single women is because the world needs us. Thank you.